Imagine walking into a local courthouse, right? You're, you know, expecting a standard traffic fine.
Yeah, maybe a few $100s for running a red light or something simple.
Right. So you pull up to the bench. The judge looks down at you. And instead of a fine, he hands out a sentence of infinite, unceasing torture.
Oh, man. Your mind would just immediately scream that this is an outrage.
Spot on. You would think the punishment does not fit the crime because we expect consequences to be calculated, finite and measurable against our own human understanding of fairness.
Right, our standard of what seems equitable.
Yeah. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are taking a deep dive into Jonathan Edwards' 1735 sermon, The Portion of the Wicked, which is based on Romans 2.8t9.
And we are really looking at a judicial landscape that just, well, it shatters our finite measuring sticks.
It really does. We are going to examine why Edwards argued that this terrifying sentence is the only mathematically perfectly just outcome for humanity.
Yeah, our mission here is to systematically examine Edwards' sobering theological framework regarding divine wrath, the temporal and eternal consequences of sin, and the absolute justice of God.
Right. And this is an analysis tailored specifically for you, the listener, to help you grasp the sheer gravity of Reformed eschatology and what human responsibility actually means when you stand before an infinitely holy Creator.
It is a heavy topic, but so necessary to unpack. To understand what Edwards is doing here, we have to look at his starting point.
Right, which is the biblical context.
Yeah, he anchors his entire argument in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, specifically, the first 3 chapters.
And Paul's overarching argument there is pretty clear, right?
Very clear. He argues that all of humanity, both Jews and Gentiles, are under sin.
Yeah, and he points out that the Gentiles had the witness of creation and their own conscience.
Right, while the Jews actually possessed the law and the covenants.
Right.
But what Edwards highlights from this is that the Jews falsely assumed their chosen status exempted them from future wrath.
Oh, yeah. They looked at the pagan nations, pronounced judgment on their outward behaviors, while, committing the exact same offenses in the hidden corners of their own hearts.
Spot on. Paul shatters that illusion completely in Romans 2. God evaluates the reality of the heart, not ethnic heritage or religious affiliation.
So let us unpack the cause and effect dynamic that Edwards points out in the text of Romans 2.
Yeah, he splits the description of the wicked into 2 specific categories, right?
He does. There are qualifications that have the nature of a cause and those that have the nature of an effect. The cause is entirely internal.
Which is such a crucial distinction in Reformed theology.
It really is. He says the cause is being contentious against the truth, quarreling with the gospel, finding fault with its declarations, and, obeying unrighteousness instead of yielding to the truth.
That is the root right there.
Yeah. And the effect, the fruit, is the external practice of doing evil. It is fascinating how he separates the two so clearly.
And, that distinction really defines the Reformed perspective. We often look at sin completely backwards.
How so?
Well, we see the external action, right? The theft, the lie, the gossip, the violence. And we think that is the core issue.
Oh, I see. So we just try to modify the behavior.
Yeah. But Edwards argues the outward action is just the superstructure. The root is that internal rebellion against God's authority.
He uses that specific phrase, contentious against the truth.
Right. And that is not just a passive ignorance. It is an active, ongoing hostility. Sinners stumble at the gospel because they find Christ to be a rock of offense.
So their subjection to their own lusts is basically the engine driving their outward behavior.
Precisely. They obey unrighteousness because they are quite literally slaves to it. The will is bound by its own corrupt desires.
That makes me think of an analogy. Think of a house with a compromised structural foundation.
Okay, I am picturing it.
You walk through the living room and you see all these massive cracks in the drywall. Now, if you just hire a contractor to patch the drywall and paint over it, you have not actually fixed the house.
Oh, definitely not. The house is still sinking.
Right. The internal rebellion, the unbelief, the active hostility toward God, the subjection to lust, that is the severe structural failure under the ground.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it.
And the external sins, the bad habits, the moral failings, those are just the visible cracks on the walls.
Right.
So how does this challenge the modern idea that doing good things outweighs internal unbelief?
Yeah.
Because, you might encounter people today who think, well, I am generally a good person. I give to charity, I do not hurt anyone.
Yeah, they assume their moral record or their background shields them from judgment, but Edwards dismantles that assumption completely by redefining what good actually means in the sight of God.
According to the Westminster Confession, right?
Yeah. From a Westminster perspective, a work is only truly good if it proceeds from a heart purified by faith, is done according to the law of God, and is done for his glory.
So if the structural base is a heart at enmity with the Creator, then even the seemingly positive actions are tainted by that core rebellion.
Spot on. God evaluates the root. He looks at whether the heart is submitted to his truth or contentious against it.
Because if the internal state is characterized by unbelief, the inevitable consequence is divine indignation. The outward good deeds are just, well, painted drywall over a collapsing foundation.
That is a staggering reality to confront.
It is. Having identified the nature of that rebellion, the discussion in the sermon shifts to how God responds to this rebellion during a person's earthly life.
Right, because it does not just immediately skip to eternity.
No, it does not. Edwards talks about the temporal wrath of abandonment. He argues that indignation often pursues wicked individuals in this life first.
And the first, and really the most terrifying method of this, is God simply leaving them to themselves.
I want to spend some time here because the mechanics of this are just chilling. How does that work theologically?
Well, this brings us to the concept of God withdrawing his restraining grace. In Reformed thought, we understand that human beings, left entirely to their own fallen nature, would run headlong into absolute destruction instantly.
Because of total depravity.
Yeah, exactly. Spot on. What keeps the world from being a literal hell on earth right now is God's restraining hand, what we call common grace. God actively prevents people from being as wicked as they could be.
But as a form of temporal judgment, God sometimes removes that hand.
He does. Edwards quotes Hosea 4.1 Theum, Ephraim is joined to his idols, let him alone.
Let him alone. That has to be one of the most frightening phrases in all of Scripture.
It really is. God leaves the sinner to their own blindness, to the covetousness and the hardness of their own heart. He points to biblical examples like Saul and Judas to show what fatal backsliding looks like when God steps away.
I have to offer a specific pushback here, or at least voice what I know many people listening might be thinking upon hearing this.
Go ahead.
Well, if God leaves someone to their own choices, isn't that what people actually want? I mean, they want freedom. They want autonomy from God's rules.
Yeah, that is the modern mindset for sure.
Right. So if God steps back and says, have it your way, why is that a punishment? Let me frame it like this with an analogy.
Okay, let us hear it.
Think of a toddler who desperately wants to play in the middle of a busy highway. The toddler thinks the parent holding their hand is a tyrant restricting their freedom.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But if the parent says, okay, have it your way, and just lets go of their hand, that is not granting freedom. That is a severe, fatal judgment.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. The sinner perceives God's law as a burden and their own desires as true freedom.
Even though those desires are entirely self-destructive.
Right. Their desires are utterly corrupted, so when God gives them over to those desires, he is quite literally handing them the tools of their own ruin.
And Edwards points out that this abandonment often looks like massive success to the outside world, doesn't it?
Yeah, he details how prosperity itself becomes a curse for the wicked. If they possess wealth, honor, or pleasure, the curse of God attends it.
So even their ordinary food, their employments, and the very houses they live in become traps.
Exactly. Prosperity acts as an anesthetic. It insulates them from feeling their real need for God.
Edwards uses some very vivid language here. He says these prosperous people spend their entire lives trying to extract happiness from the world, and they're just feeding on the east wind.
Which is such a brilliant, terrifying metaphor.
It is. Let us pause and translate that metaphor for a second for the listener. The east wind, in the biblical context of the Middle East, is the hot, scorching desert wind that blasts the crops. It brings famine.
It dries everything up.
Right. So Edwards is saying that trying to find soul satisfaction in money or career or status is like trying to satisfy your physical hunger by opening your mouth and trying to eat a scorching desert hurricane.
Yeah, it does not just fail to fill you, it actively dehydrates and destroys you from the inside out.
That is the psychological torment of prosperity without God.
And the wealth accelerates the moral decay because it provides the resources to indulge every single corrupt desire.
Yeah. And Edwards takes it even a step further. He says their spiritual privileges become a curse as well.
This is a heavy warning for anyone sitting in a church pew. He says, having a Bible, sitting under solid preaching, hearing the gospel, if those things are met with a hardened, unbelieving heart, they only aggravate the person's guilt.
The word of God becomes a savor of death unto death for them.
Right. Every sermon they hear without repenting adds another layer of culpability. They could live 100 years, gather all this wealth, attend church every Sunday, and their souls are completely starving.
Because God's indignation is quietly pursuing them through the very mundane details of their earthly success. But, while temporal life contains these severe warnings, it is finite.
Yeah, that temporal abandonment, that horrifying freedom to ruin yourself, has a hard expiration date.
Right. The discussion in the sermon moves to the inevitable threshold everyone must cross. The terrifying reality of Edwards' theology is not just that God lets go of your hand, it is what happens the moment the clock runs out on that freedom.
And that brings us to the king of terrors. Edwards transitions to what he calls the execution of the law's curse, which is death.
He points out that death is a far different thing for the wicked than for the righteous. They are, as the proverb says, driven away in their wickedness.
The stripping away process at death is absolute and, well, instantaneous. Edwards references the parable of the wealthy fool from the Gospel of Luke.
Oh, right. The man who had ground that brought forth plentifully.
Yeah. He decided to pull down his barns, build greater ones, and tell his soul to take its ease, eat, drink, and be merry.
But God said to him, "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee."
Precisely. Death cuts off all projects and all designs at one single blow. As they came naked into the world, naked they must return. Every earthly comfort, every distraction, every dollar, every shred of common grace is spoiled instantly.
Edwards highlights the psychological terror on the deathbed. He talks about the drastic shift in perspective that happens when a person realizes their time is up.
The panic must be unimaginable.
Suddenly, all those riches mean absolutely nothing. Time, which they used to waste and delay repentance with, becomes infinitely precious. Some cry out, 1,000 worlds for an hour, for a moment.
Yeah, when the reality of eternity finally breaks through the anesthetic of the world.
Let us pose a thought experiment for you listening right now. Imagine viewing your entire life, all your current anxieties, your financial goals, your arguments, your streaming queues, from the vantage point of your final 5 minutes of breathing.
That really changes the lighting on everything, doesn't it?
It completely alters your current priorities. What retains its value when you are standing on the edge of that boundary?
It exposes the sheer madness of living for the present world. When a person stands on that edge without a mediator, the realization is crushing.
And Edwards notes the specific tragedy of those who die in youth as well, right?
Yeah, he does. Wrath pursues them and overtakes them in the very midst of their vanity. They are stopped in the middle of their career in sin. All their youthful pleasures are violently torn away.
He describes them coming to the edge of the boundless gulf of eternity, launching forth into it without any God or Savior to take care of them.
He says they feel themselves clasped in the cold arms of death, their breath failing, their eyes growing dim. The horror of that moment, he says, cannot be told nor conceived.
The physical body fails, but the text reveals the soul's awareness sharpens immediately upon crossing over. This brings us to the particular judgment and the intermediate state.
Right. Edwards asserts that immediately at death, the soul undergoes a particular judgment. It does not sleep. It is cast down into hell while awaiting the final resurrection at the end of the world.
What are the actual mechanics of this particular judgment? Because people might be confused about the timeline here.
He makes a very careful theological distinction here based on Reformed eschatology. This particular judgment is not the grand, outward, solemn transaction that will happen at the end of the world.
Okay, so Christ does not descend from heaven for this specific moment.
Right. No. Instead, as soon as the soul departs the body, it is made immediately sensible of the presence of an infinitely holy God.
The soul comes naked, carrying all its guilt, filthiness, and rebellion directly before its judge.
Yeah. God manifests as his strict justice inwardly, to the immediate view of the soul and the apprehension of the conscience. The door of mercy shuts forever.
And the irrevocable sentence is passed in the quietness of that spiritual reality. That inward manifestation of justice is chilling.
There is no grand outward spectacle yet.
Right. There is no courtroom drama, no chance to argue, no calling of witnesses, just the immediate crushing weight of total exposure before holiness.
Edwards contrasts the death of a believer with the death of the wicked in a way that is just hard to shake.
How does he frame that contrast?
Well, when a believer like Lazarus dies, the text says he is carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. But for the wicked, Edwards envisions their soul being seized by fierce, cruel spirits.
Oh, wow. So there are no good angels to guard them.
No. God takes no merciful care of them. They are left in the hands of the very demons they followed in life.
We must look at what they experience in that intermediate state. Edwards points out that while they are in hell, this is still not their complete punishment.
Right, they're reserved in chains of darkness for the judgment of the great day, much like the demons themselves.
But their current torment is extreme. He references the wealthy man in Luke 16, who lifts up his eyes in torment and begs for a drop of water to cool his tongue because he is tormented in a flame.
And Edwards suggests the flame is not just around him, but in him. They are full of the wrath of God.
And he also mentions they are tormented by their own conscience. That is the biblical concept of the worm that never dies.
Yeah, the conscience is fully awakened.
Let us explain this mechanistically. Think of the human conscience in this life, like a smoke detector with a dying battery.
Okay, that is a relatable analogy.
Right. We can easily ignore the faint chirps. Or we can just take the battery out completely through distractions, entertainment, or, self-justification.
We find ways to muffle the sound.
Yeah. But Edwards is saying that in the intermediate state, that smoke detector is hardwired directly into your consciousness. The alarm is deafening, and there is no mute button.
You are trapped in a room with your own perfect memory of every single warning you ignored.
Every sermon you slept through, every plea from a Christian friend you brushed off, every moment of conviction you suppressed so you could go indulge a lust. How does that memory fuel the fire?
It fuels it because they have nothing else to do in that state but reflect on their own folly. That is the terror of an awakened conscience when there is no longer any blood of Christ available to cleanse it.
Because in this life, men find ways to sedate their conscience.
Right. But the conscience operates with perfect, unclouded accuracy in the next life, constantly agreeing with God's justice against the self. You literally become your own accuser.
And as Edwards notes, they also suffer from the terrifying anticipation of the final judgment.
Yeah, they know a day is coming when their torment will be vastly augmented. They're essentially in a holding cell, fully aware of the upcoming execution date.
This section confronts you with the absolute finality of death. All earthly comforts and second chances expire the moment the soul separates from the body.
It is a sobering reality.
As terrible as this intermediate state is, Edwards notes it is just a holding cell before a much larger final event. And that leads us to the resurrection of damnation.
The final judgment brings the resurrection of the wicked. They are summoned unwillingly, their souls dragged out of hell to be reunited with their physical bodies.
And this is the part I want to raise an original question about. If the soul is already suffering in the intermediate state, why drag the physical body back out of the grave?
It is a valid question.
Right. What is the theological necessity of physical resurrection for the wicked? Why isn't a spiritual punishment enough? I tried to reason through Edwards' text on this.
And what did you see there?
Well, because the physical body was the tool used to rebel against God. The hands that stole, the tongue that lied, the eyes that consumed wickedness, the feet that ran toward mischief.
Yeah, they were instruments of unrighteousness.
So exact justice requires that the very instrument of rebellion is resurrected to face the consequences. The body and soul sin together. They must be judged together.
That makes terrifying sense. The body was the weapon, so the weapon is brought into the courtroom.
Uh,
Furthermore, Edwards points out a stark contrast regarding the bodies themselves.
what kind of contrast?
He notes that while the bodies of the saints will rise glorious, like unto Christ's glorious body, the bodies of the wicked will arise proportionately deformed and hideous, matching the hideousness of the soul.
Oh, wow. Because in this world, a polluted soul is often hidden inside a beautiful outward appearance.
Right. You can have a heart full of malice and a face that belongs on a magazine cover. But in the resurrection, the external form will perfectly match the hellish deformity of the soul within.
They stand before the judge, and hidden sins are brought to light. All those secret things kept hidden from the world are broadcast across the universe.
And former companions, people they tempted into sin, rise up to condemn them. Even the heathen who had lesser advantages will rise up in judgment against them.
They will be struck completely dumb. And then the final sentence is pronounced, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels."
Edwards notes that every syllable of that sentence will pierce their souls like lightning. Upon that sentence, the world as we know it dissolves.
He describes the heavens passing away with a great noise, the elements melting with fervent heat.
Yeah, just as God once judged the world with a deluge of water in Noah's day, he will drown it in a deluge of fire. The wicked enter into that state, and their punishment is complete.
And Edwards labors to describe the duration. It is eternal. They must wear out 1,000 years after another, Millions of ages pass, and the arithmetic of time fails.
There is no end to it.
Let us pause on that word, eternal. Faced with such a staggering description of eternal punishment, the human mind naturally protests.
It really does. People recoil at the concept.
Why does God's justice demand an unending duration? Why not just an intense punishment for a set number of years and then annihilation?
This gets right to the heart of Reformed theology regarding the nature of God. The severity of a crime is measured by the worth and dignity of the one offended.
Okay, lay that out for us.
If you strike a fellow citizen, you might get a fine. If you strike a king, you might be executed. Sin is an offense committed against an infinitely holy, infinitely worthy creator.
Therefore, the debt incurred by sin is an infinite debt.
Precisely. A finite creature cannot pay an infinite debt in a finite amount of time. It is mathematically impossible. Therefore, the duration of the payment must stretch into eternity.
Arithmetic fails because the debt is boundless. There is no rest, no atonement, and the torment never grows easier by becoming accustomed to it.
So, if God is doing all of this, condemning souls, resurrecting bodies for infinite torment, and dissolving the world in fire, the immediate human response is usually pushback.
Right. People say, this is an overreaction, God is too severe. This leads us to Section 6, answering objections and the justice of God.
Wicked men often think God is too severe. But Edwards provides a rigorous, multi-point defense of God's justice. He systematically walks through these arguments to a congregation that was likely just as horrified as we are.
He addresses the sinner directly, doesn't he?
He does. He dismantles every objection. First, he argues it is perfectly just for God to leave you to yourself because you obstinately refuse to leave your sins.
God commanded you to forsake them, and you allowed them to sit on the throne of your heart. You harbored God's mortal enemies, sin and Satan.
Right. Why should God dwell with that which is odious to him? Second, it is just for God to curse your earthly blessings because you used every one of them as weapons against his honor.
You used your health, your money, your time to serve his enemies. And he goes on to say it is just to cut your life short because you abused his patience.
Yeah. God gave you breath today, and instead of repenting, you used that breath to multiply transgressions.
I want to highlight the most striking counterarguments Edwards makes against the complaint that the punishment is too great. He uses this incredible phrase. He says to the sinner, "You stretched out your hand against God and ran upon the thick bosses of his buckler."
That is some intense imagery.
It is. Let us translate that.
Right.
A buckler is a shield, and the boss is the heavy spiked metal center of that shield.
Okay, so what is Edwards saying with that?
Edwards is saying sinners aren't just passively ignoring God. They are actively, aggressively throwing themselves onto the spikes of his armor. It is an image of suicidal rebellion.
Wow.
You cannot complain about the severity of a sentence when you spent your life throwing yourself onto the judge's sword.
Yeah.
It is like a criminal complaining a fine is too high, yet the judge points out the criminal ignored every warning sign and dared the authorities to act.
Spot on. You had his commands repeated, his threatenings set before you hundreds of times, and you went on doing the very things he forbade right to his face.
You bid defiance to the Almighty. It is no wonder he will make you know how terrible his wrath actually is.
And then Edwards makes the specific point about Christ's rejected love, which I think is his strongest argument.
Yes, elaborate on Edwards' point regarding Christ, because it stopped me in my tracks. It seems he's essentially using a mathematical equation. The severity of the punishment is directly tied to the value of the rescue mission that was rejected.
That is a great way to summarize it. He asks the sinner to weigh the wrath they are afraid of against the love they have actively rejected. God provided a way of escape at an infinite cost.
He gave his only begotten Son, a person equal with God.
Right, to become incarnate, to suffer death, to be made a curse, and to absorb the dreadful wrath of God. This glorious person stood and knocked at your door.
And this infinite love was offered times without number. And the sinner looked at Christ and saw no beauty to desire him. They loved their sins more than the blood of the Son of God.
So Edwards concludes that the misery of hell is not greater than the infinite love and glory the sinner has despised. If you trample on the blood of the Son of God, what kind of punishment do you suppose is mathematically appropriate?
That silences the argument completely. The infinite value of the blood demands an infinite penalty if it is trampled.
It really does.
Edwards points out a brilliant logical flaw in the sinner's complaint as well. He says, if you complain this punishment is truly too great, why wasn't the threat of it enough to stop you from sinning?
Yeah, That is a devastating question.
If it is so unreasonable and massive, why did you make light of it? You acted as if it was not great enough to deter you. You went on day after day gathering fuel for your own fire.
You dared God to do his worst.
Right. You cannot live your life treating the threat of hell as a joke and then complain at the judgment seat that it is too severe.
The sinner condemns himself out of his own mouth. If God is true, his threatenings are substantial, not mere shadows. He is not using fallacious tricks to frighten men into submission.
He is a God of truth who will by no means clear the guilty.
Reason itself teaches that a wise and just creator must govern his creatures and make a difference between the good and the bad. To think God would let men live in wickedness, prosper, and then simply die like beasts with no future accounting is to deny the very justice of God.
This challenges you to evaluate your own view of God. Do you view his warnings as mere fables? Do you think the Bible's descriptions of judgment are just ancient scare tactics?
Or do you view them as the guaranteed promises of a perfectly holy creator who cannot look upon sin?
We have to reckon with the reality that God's nature is infinitely averse to sin, much more than our human nature is averse to pain.
So to synthesize the trajectory of Edward's sermon, he shows that the portion allotted to the wicked is not an arbitrary lightning bolt thrown by an unpredictable deity.
No, it is a highly ordered, perfectly just, direct result of the sinner's own unyielding rebellion and rejection of truth.
It plays out chronologically, through temporal abandonment where God hands them over to their own desires,
Through the horror of the deathbed, where all illusions fail,
through the immediate conscious torment of the intermediate state,
and finally, through the bodily resurrection to face the eternal, unquenchable fire. Every step is governed by strict, unassailable justice.
God's justice is perfect.
We have spent this time walking through a very heavy, very dark reality. We just examined the sheer, infinite weight of God's wrath against sin, a wrath that arithmetic fails to calculate.
It is a heavy weight to bear.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought built directly on the source material we just covered.
What is that final consideration?
If this eternal, unmitigated terror is the exact penalty that every single sin requires from a perfectly just God, consider what was actually happening on the cross.
Oh, wow. Yes.
How heavy was the burden Christ bore during those hours in the darkness? He stepped in to absorb this specific, unquenchable wrath, drinking the cup of indignation down to the dregs on behalf of his people.
He took the infinite debt upon himself.
Let the sheer terror of Edward's warning shape your understanding of how massive, how costly, and how breathtaking God's grace truly is today.